Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our Thursday morning weekly Parsha Shiur. This morning, rather than actually studying the Parsha of the week, which of course we usually do every Thursday, I thought that we could reflect and learn together about the unique date that this Shabbos, Parsha Vaischanan, falls out on. We'll discuss something that isn't directly related to the Parsha, but it is fascinating. There is a lot to learn about it, and it has to do specifically with the date that this Shabbos falls out on, which is, of course, the 15th day of Av, called Chamisha Asar B'Av, or Tu B'Av, all of which mean the same thing, the 15th day of the month of Av. Now, the reason why this date is so special is because the Gemara in Masechta Taanis makes an incredibly strange, very difficult to understand. The Gemara, in fact, struggles to understand this particular statement. The Gemara makes a very strange statement about the 15th day of Av. The Gemara says, again, this is toward the end of Masechta Taanis, Omar Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel taught, Lo yehoyu yomim tovim liyisrael kachamisha asar b'av v'kiyom HaKippurim. The Jewish people have no 2 days as festive, no Yom Tov for the Jewish people, like the 15th day of Av, Chamisha Asar B'Av, and like Yom Kippur. The two happiest and most celebratory days of the year are the 15th day of Av and Yom Kippur, which, it reminds me of that great joke about a couple who are celebrating their 70th anniversary. And the woman gets up to toast her husband after living together for 70 years. They got married in their 20s. They're now Baruch Hashem in their 90s. And the woman stands up to toast her husband. And she tells the whole crowd, all the people who have come to celebrate with them in honor of their 70th anniversary, Ein Kleinigkeit, can you imagine? 70 years. And she raises her glass, and she toasts her husband, and she says, I want to make a special l'chaim to my husband for sticking it out with me for 70 years. 70 years, unbelievable. The same woman and the same man, 70 years. And she turns to the whole crowd and she says to them, I want you all to know that 70 years with my husband felt like 2 days. And the whole crowd goes, oh, that's so beautiful. Can you imagine? This couple must be so much in love that 70 years passed by like 2 days. Unbelievable. And after she finishes her speech and makes her toast and everybody drinks l'chaim, so somebody next to her says, lady, what do you mean 70 years felt like 2 days? What's 2 days? Why didn't you say 1 day? Why didn't you say 2 hours? Why didn't you say 5 minutes? Why didn't you say a half a day? What's 2 days? She says, 70 years with my husband have felt like 2 days, like Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur. 2 days. It depends which 2 days. Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur are the two most difficult and painful days on the Jewish calendar, where we fast and where we suffer and where we feel the pain of Jewish history. So the Gemara says that actually the two greatest days of the year in the Jewish calendar, the two biggest Yomim Tovim, are the 15th day of Av and Yom Kippur. Now, stop an average Yid in the street and ask them, what's the greatest Yom Tov of the year? I mean, Purim is pretty high up there. We like Hanukkah, we like any Yom Tov, by the way, pretty much what we can eat, is okay. Or at least not bad. I mean, Yom Kippur, there's nothing to eat. And Chamisha Asar B'Av, the 15th day of Av, I mean, what? There's no Kiddush, there's no Havdalah, there's no special Torah reading, there's nothing. This year, Baruch Hashem, it happens to fall out on Shabbos. But other than that, on a regular year, Chamisha Asar B'Av, all right. So we don't say Tachnun, in some shuls and some minyanim. This is the tremendous Yom Tov when there's no Tachnun. But there's other days in the calendar where there's no Tachnun. The Satmar Rebbe once said, very famously, the Satmar Rebbe said, what's the difference between a Yid and a Goy? He says, a Goy will never understand the pleasure that a Jew has when he comes to shul and he finds out there's no Tachnun today. A Goy can never understand that. All right, so there's no Tachnun on Chamisha Asar B'Av, but how do these 2 days, Chamisha Asar B'Av and Yom Kippur, become the greatest Yomim Tovim of the year on the Jewish calendar. I mean, even till now, this was written, this was recorded in the Gemara 2,000 years ago. Like I'm saying, stop an average from a Yid in the street and ask them, what's the greatest Yom Tov of the year? Well, they tell you Chamisha Asar of the 15th day of Av and Yom Kippur. I'm not convinced. But nevertheless, the Gemara says in the name of the sages of the Mishnah, Chamisha Asar ba'Av and Yom Kippur, the two greatest Yomim Tovim on the Jewish calendar. All right. So the Gemara dissects. The Gemara says, okay, I can understand, says the Gemara, you tell me Yom Kippur is the greatest Yom Tov of the year. Maybe a little surprising, but I can wrap my head around it, says the Gemara. The Gemara has an expression, bishloima. Bishloima means, this part I can understand. This part I can make sense out of. Maybe it's a little surprising. I have to kind of travel an intellectual journey, but I can get there. I can wrap my head, says the Gemara, around the idea that Yom Kippur is the greatest Yom Tov of the year. After all, a day of Slicha Mechila, the day that the Rabbi Shalom forgives the Jews. What could be better than that? The day that Moshe Rabbeinu gave the Jews the second set of luchas happened on Yom Kippur. This was an indication that the Jews had been forgiven for worshiping the golden calf. This was an indication that they had restored their relationship with Hashem. All right, I understand that too, says the Gemara. It also sounds like a great Yom Tov. I can get that, says the Gemara. You tell me Yom Kippur is the greatest Yom Tov of the year, I understand. But Chamisha Asar ba'Av, the 15th day of Av, Mahi, in the words of the Gemara, the Gemara literally says, what is that? What is the 15th day of Av unique? For what reason? What makes it special? Okay, the Gemara gives about 6 or 7 answers. We're not going to be able to go through all of them today, but I'd like to go through some of them to explain how the Gemara answers this question. What is so special about the 15th day of Av? And then to take kind of like a step back and think about what the Gemara is really trying to tell us with this teaching, with this passage, that the greatest Yom Tov of the year is the 15th day of Av. All right. The first thing the Gemara says is that on the 15th day of Av, the Shvatim, the tribes, were all allowed to marry each other. Intermarriage between Jewish tribes became permissible on the 15th day of Av. Which is why later on we'll learn, if we have time, we'll get into this a little bit today, which is why Chamisha Asar ba'Av eventually becomes known as Shidduch Day. It wasn't the Shidduch Day business, the fact that many Shidduchim were made on the 15th day of Av is not actually originally the reason why the 15th day of Av is a Yom Tov. Once it became a Yom Tov, they dedicated it as a Shidduch. They celebrated it that day. It was celebrated by making Shidduchim. Again, if we have time, we'll get into some of this, how this was orchestrated by the Chachamim. It was an amazing procedure. The Jewish girls would go out to the fields. They would get dressed up. The young men would go out to the fields. They would watch the young girls dance. It was a good time for the Jews. But that was how they celebrated the 15th day of Av. Why they celebrated this way? So the first thing the Gemara says is that because this was the day that the tribes were all allowed to marry each other. Now, what in heaven's name does that mean? Since when is there a problem with the Jewish tribes marrying each other? So very briefly, the Gemara explains like this. We all know the famous story of Bnei Tzlofchad. Bnei Tzlofchad, the Torah tells us, Tzlofchad was a man who had daughters and he had no sons. And after he passed in the desert, his daughters claimed their father's inheritance in the land of Eretz Yisrael. Although until the story of Bnei Tzlofchad, inheritance went only from a man to his sons, because Tzlofchad had no sons, he was the first precedent for this din Torah, for this shaila of what happens to a man who only has daughters. And they, Bnei Tzlofchad, championed this halacha that if a man has no sons, his portion in Eretz Yisrael is inherited by his daughters. This part of the story is very famous. What's less famous is that after his daughters inherited his land, or after the halacha was given that his daughters should inherit his land in Eretz Yisrael, the members of Tzlofchad's tribe came to Moshe Rabbeinu and complained. They had a concern. They said, what if Tzlofchod's daughters marry men from other tribes and then they pass? The halacha is that after a woman passes, her property is inherited by her husband. Her possessions are inherited by her husband. So the members of the tribe of Tzlofchod came to Moshe and said, what will happen? The daughters of Tzlofchod have now inherited Tzlofchod's land, granted. What if they marry men from other tribes and they pass before their husbands? Then the land will go from one tribe to another tribe. The tribe of Tzlofchod, will end up with a smaller piece of Eretz Yisrael because of Tzlofchod's daughters. Moshe Rabbeinu goes back to consult with Hashem, and the answer which is given is that this in fact is correct, and Tzlofchod may only marry men from their own tribe. They were, if I remember correctly, from the tribe of Menashe. The daughters of Tzlofchod were from the tribe of Menashe. They were only allowed to marry men from the tribe of Menashe, so that the possession, the land of Eretz Yisrael, would not transition from one tribe to another. In fact, the Torah says this became the halacha. That if girls ever inherited their father because the man passed without sons, so the girls inherited their father, in order to protect that tribe's ownership over the land of Eretz Yisrael, they were only allowed to marry men within their tribe. Says the Gemara, this halacha only lasted for one generation. After this generation, on the 15th day of Av, it was declared, from now on, a woman can marry a man from any tribe she falls in love with, any tribe she likes, even if she inherited from her father, and even if she falls in love with a man from a different shevet, so be it. Yom shehutru shvatim zeh lo zeh, the tribes were, members of tribes were allowed to marry each other from other tribes. This was the first reason why this happened on the 15th day of Av. This is the first reason why the 15th day of Av is a great Yom Tov. Reason number two, the Gemara says, there was a terrible story, the details of which are not for today. There was a terrible story called Pilegesh Begiva. Pilegesh Begiva has to do with a very brutal treatment of a woman by members of Shevet Binyamin. There was actually a civil war between the Jews against Shevet Binyamin after the story, because they were so appalled by what some of the members of Shevet Binyamin had done. They raped a woman, they killed her. A very famous story called Pilegesh Begiva. After the story of Pilegesh Begiva, the Gemara says, the Torah tells us, that all the other Jewish tribes swore that they would not allow their daughters to marry men from Shevet Binyamin. The Jews were so upset at this particular treatment of a particular woman by Shevet Binyamin. They were so appalled by what had happened, disgusted, infuriated, angry. The men were so abusive to her that they swore off. They said, we're not going to let our daughters marry anybody from Shevet Binyamin. Once again, this also lasted for a particular amount of time, after which on the 15th day of Av, this decree was also abolished. They said Shevet Binyamin has served its time. It's done what it has to. And once again, the Gemara says, Yom Shehuta Shevet Binyamin Loved Bakol. Members of Shevet Binyamin could now marry other women from other tribes. Was seen once again as a significant event, something that happened on the 15th day of Av. Next, the Gemara says something else happened on the 15th day of Av. This again, I'll give it to you in the words of the Gemara, then I'll explain. The Gemara says, Hoshea ben Elah, who was a Jewish king, removed the blockages, the blockades on the road that had been put in Eretz Yisrael, that had been put there by a man called Yerovam ben Nevat. So again, the Gemara doesn't explain, but here is briefly the history of what happened. So in the days of the reign of Shlomo HaMelech's son, Shlomo was succeeded by his son. Shlomo's son's name was Rehovam. In the days of the reign of Rehovam, because of the decision that Rehovam made, the Jewish people broke down into two kingdoms. Rehovam was left with two tribes, and an individual called Yerovam ben Nevat. Yerovam ben Nevat broke the Jewish monarchy. He broke the Jewish empire into two groups. He took 10 tribes, separated from Rehoboam, the son of Shlomo HaMelech, took the 10 tribes up to the northern part of Eretz Yisrael, and they had their own malucha, they had their own kingdom. This was seen as a terrible tragedy that befell the Jewish people. And actually, Rehoboam, the son of Shlomo, is blamed significantly blamed for this falling apart of the Jewish nation. What happened was, after Shlomo HaMelech passed, the Jewish people came to his son Rehoboam and they said to him, look, your father was a great king. Your father was Shlomo HaMelech, was wise and powerful and mighty and protected the Jewish people, built the Beis HaMikdash, etc. But the people told Rehoboam, your father Shlomo was also tough. He was a strong king. He was hard on the people. And they begged Rehoboam actually to take an easier and lighter approach with them. The Torah says that Rehoboam asked for 3 days to take counsel. He took counsel with his father's advisors, with Shlomo Melech's advisors, and with his own advisors. His father's advisors told him to acquiesce to the will of the people. His father's advisors told him that the petitioners were in fact correct, and that Shlomo Melech, his greatness notwithstanding, his rulership took a high price. The people paid a high price because he was so tough. He was strong on the people. He demanded so much from them. He demanded from them in taxes and workload. He was just a rough king. Rehoboam's advisors, Rehoboam took advice from his father Shlomo Melech's advisors. And Shlomo Melech's advisors told Rehoboam to actually follow the request of the petitioners and to be easier on the people. Rehoboam also took advice from his own advisors, his buddies from yeshiva, his benchmates, his dormitory mates. And they gave him the exact opposite advice. Surprise, surprise. They told him that he should be just as strong as his father, even tougher. They said, don't let the people push you around. They said, if you're going to be a shmata on day one, the Jewish, they're going to wash the floor with you. You show them who's boss. You show it to them from the beginning. And from day one, you tell them there's a new sheriff in town. I'm in charge, and I'm going to be just as tough as my dad, even tougher. He got these two conflicting pieces of advice. He chose to disregard the advice that he got from Shlomo Melech's advisors and follow the advice of his own advisors, the younger people. And he came back to the petitioners and told them, my father was nothing. He said, my father beat you with strings, I'm going to beat you with whips. My pinky, he said, Rehoboam said, my pinky is as big as my father's loins. And he made it clear that he had every intention of being just as tough as his father and even tougher. And under the leadership of Yerovam ben Nevat, the Jewish nation split. I want to say split in half, but it's not really in half. 10 tribes went up north, 2 tribes remained down below. Rehoboam remained only with 2 tribes, Yehuda and Benjamin, that's it. All the other 10 tribes left. They went up north and they appointed Yerovam as their king, and the Jewish nation was never the same. It is not for today's Shiur, but it is impossible to fully grasp the heaviness, the gravitas of this particular experience. Because of this, eventually, the 10 Jewish tribes were actually completely lost. The king of Assyria, not much more than 100 years after the split of the 10 tribes from the 2 tribes, attacks the northern part of Eretz Yisrael, disperses these 10 Jewish tribes, and they're sent into Golus, and actually never to be heard of or found, never to be heard from or heard of or discovered again. This is what we refer to as the 10 lost tribes. Everything, the entire Jewish nation that we have today remains only from the Melucha from the kingdom of Rehoboam. and which is really just essentially primarily from 2 tribes. The other 10 tribes were almost entirely lost. One of the greatest mind-boggling mysteries in all of Jewish history. How did 10 Jewish tribes just disappear? Where are they? It seems that they just assimilated and disintegrated and were gone. 10 out of the 12 Jewish tribes. But be it as it may, the Jewish nation splits. 2 tribes remain down south under the leadership of Rehoboam. 10 tribes go up north under the leadership of Yerovam ben Nevat. Now, here things got very messy, very complicated, and very dirty. Yerovam ben Nevat, the king of the 10 tribes up north, had a problem, what he perceived as a problem. The problem was that the Jewish people had a mitzvah 3 times a year of going to the Beis HaMikdash. And the Beis HaMikdash was located, of course, in Yerushalayim under the rulership of Rehoboam, under the rulership of the son of Shlomo HaMelech. Yerovam was deeply concerned. Yerovam, the king of the 10 tribes up north, is deeply concerned that if the Jews fulfill this mitzvah and are oila regel, that they go to the Beis HaMikdash, as they're supposed to, as they're obligated to 3 times a year, then the divide between the two sections of the Jewish nation, the divide is going to dissolve, and the Jews in the Beis HaMikdash on Yom Tov, in the presence of Hashem, will repair the rift and all come together under the leadership of the son of Shlomo HaMelech. Yerovam ben Nevat was concerned, the king of the 10 tribes was concerned, that if they all went to the Beis HaMikdash, the Jews would find a way to repair the rift, and he, Yerovam, would be left without a royal seat. And so the Torah spares no detail in describing what Yerovam did in order to make sure this would not happen. Yerovam literally blocked the roads, did not allow Jews to travel to the Beis HaMikdash on Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, and erected in the northern part of Eretz Yisrael other temples, if you will, other idols, forms of Avodah Zarah, and encouraged the Jews, rather than going to the Beis HaMikdash and serving Hashem, to remain there under his dominion and go to these temples that he had built and worship Avodah Zarah. This became spiritually a terrible, terrible moment for the Jewish people. Because of this, the Gemara says in Masechta Sanhedrin that Yerovam ben Nevat does not have a chelik in Olam Haba, does not have a portion in the world to come, because he didn't just sin, but he put the Jewish people who were accustomed to going 3 times a year on a pilgrimage to the Beis HaMikdash, he put them in a position where they couldn't go. He gave them other alternatives. Many Jews, in fact, did worship Avodah Zarah because of this. Yerovam ben Nevat blocked the way, physically difficult. I mean, it's difficult to wrap our heads around how a Jew could do such a thing, but he did. He blocked the roads, didn't allow the Jews physically to go to the Beis HaMikdash, and all but forced them or encouraged them to go to other temples and houses of worship where they worshipped Avodah Zarah. Okay, what's this got to do with Chamisha Asar B'Av? Says the Gemara, Yerovam ben Nevat was succeeded by another king and another king by another king, Achav and others. But in the end, the last king of these 10 tribes was a man by the name of Hoshea ben Elah. The reason why he was the last king is because in his days, the king of Assyria waged war, like I mentioned before, took all these 10 tribes captive, dispersed them, never to be heard from again. These 10 tribes became the 10 lost tribes under the rulership of this king Hoshea. But before Hoshea and his kingdom went down, before these 10 tribes were lost, never to be heard from again, Hoshea ben Elah, this king Hoshea in his day, removed the blockages on the roads and allowed the Jews, if they so desired, to go to the Beis HaMikdash 3 times a year on Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. Now, of course, at this stage, the Jews, the 10 tribes, have been steeped in a culture of idol worship for more than 100 years. Many of the Jews, in fact, even when they're given the option to go to the Beis HaMikdash, don't go. Many of the Jews have become too accustomed to their idol worshipping ways, and they choose not to follow the path that leads them to the Beis HaMikdash, but rather stay there up north. But at least, says the Gemara, Hoshea gave these 10 members of the 10 tribes the option. They could go to the Beis HaMikdash if they wanted to. And yes, the blockades on these roads were removed on the 15th day of Av. Number 4. So again, number 1, this is the day that the decree against girls who've inherited property in Eretz Yisrael from their fathers may not have to marry men within their own tribes. This is the day that decree is abolished. Number 2, this is the day when members of Shevet Binyamin are allowed to marry women from other tribes. Number 3, this is the day when the blockades are removed and the Jews from the 10 tribes could go to the Beis HaMikdash on Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot, or for that matter, anytime, if they so desired. Number 4, the Talmud says, on the 15th day of Av, many Jews who had been massacred in a city called Beitar were allowed to be buried. So this is a more famous story. This is the story of the famous Bar Kochva revolt. Bar Kochva led a revolt in the times of the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash against the Romans. After the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, at one particular stage, his revolt seemed like it was going to actually succeed, and the Jews were going to cast off the Roman yoke from their necks. Bar Kochva, in fact, in his day, at some point was even believed to possibly be Mashiach. The Jews, even some of the great sages believed that he might be Mashiach because of his great success. But ultimately, it ends in disaster. It ends in disaster. One of the strongholds of Bar Kochva is the famous city called Beitar, and the Romans on Tisha B'Av, in fact, on Tisha B'Av, a couple of years after the destruction of the temple, they massacre the Jews in Beitar. In a further effort to humiliate the Jews, to crush their spirit, and to see to it that Jews never lead another revolt again, the Romans forbade the Jews that the punishment of death, by threat of death, to bury the Jews who had been killed in Beitar. And so I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but suffice it to say it was at least thousands, maybe tens of thousands, maybe more, of Jews who were killed in Beitar on Tisha B'Av. Again, this is not the same Tisha B'Av as the year of the Churban Beis HaMikdash destruction. This is years and years later. The Romans did not allow those Jews who had been killed in Beitar on Tisha B'Av to be buried, until at some point the Romans lifted the decree and they allowed the Jews to bury those who had been killed in Beitar. What date was it that they allowed the Jews to bury the deceased of Beitar, Harugei Beitar? The Gemara says it was on the 15th day of Av. And on that day, the rabbis instituted an additional blessing in Birchas Hamazon called Atoy V'Hametiv, to give thanks to Hashem for the great miracle that the bodies of Beitar had in fact not decomposed, which was clearly miraculous. They survived. The bodies survived, and they were allowed eventually to be buried and placed into the ground as they were whole. Once again, permission was granted to the Jews to bury the dead of Beitar on the 15th day of Av. Next, the Gemara says that on the 15th day of Av, the days begin to get shorter and the nights begin to get longer. There's a season shift on the 15th day of Av. It's usually around the longest day of the year, right? In English, the longest day of the year is June 21st. In the Hebrew calendar, it usually falls out around the 15th day of Av. And from that day, the nights get longer, the days get shorter. The Gemara says it was also the day when they stopped chopping down wood to use for sacrifices, to use on the altar on the Mizbeach in the Beis HaMikdash. Why is that? Very briefly, because in the Beis HaMikdash, they were only allowed to use wood that had no bugs, that had no worms. In order to make sure that the wood had no bugs, they had to chop down wood that was very dry. The drier the wood, the less chance there was that there would be bugs in the wood. And so after the 15th day of Av, they would no longer chop wood for the Beis HaMikdash, because since the sun was not as strong, it didn't beat with as much heat, they were concerned that there was moisture in the wood. And if there's moisture in the wood, there may be bugs in the wood. And if there's bugs in the wood, then the wood is not kosher to use on the Mizbeach, on the altar, to use to burn sacrifices and other things. And so they had to make sure that they had all the necessary wood for the year by the 15th day of Av. And in fact, they did. They made sure all the wood was chopped by the 15th day of Av. And when it was chopped, when they had all the wood, sufficient wood, they would actually break the axe that was used to chop the wood as an indication to make sure that everybody knew that you couldn't chop any more wood. Break the axe. We have all the wood we need. There was another reason why it was a Yom Tov. The simple understanding of this is they celebrated that they had the wood they needed to offer up all the sacrifices, all the korbanos that they would need for the rest of the year. All right, the Gemara goes on to talk about how they would celebrate the 15th day of Av. This is the most famous part. The young women would go out, they would dance in the vineyards, the young men would come out, they would watch. Those who came from good families, the women who came from good families, they would tell the young men, don't look at beauty, they would say, look at family. Family is what it's all about. The beautiful women would say, look at us, we're so beautiful, etc. The Gemara goes through what all of these women would say to try to get the young men's attention. Many shidduchim would take place on the 15th day of Av. To this day, again, this is probably the reason why the 15th day of Av is most famous. Okay. Because of all these reasons, the Gemara concludes, because of this, the 15th day of Av is the greatest Yom Tov of the year, and it's celebrated by Jews every year, the 15th day of Av, by not saying Tachlon and by trying to make shidduchim or whatever the case may be. Now, let's take a step back. Despite all of these wonderful explanations of the Gemara why the 15th day of Av is such a special Yom Tov, and it was the day that women who inherited land could marry men from other tribes, and Shevet Binyamin was welcomed, and the blockades were removed, and the people who died in Beitar could be buried, and they had enough wood for the Beis HaMikdash. Despite all these things, when you read it, not only does it not seem to answer the question, but the question seems to only become worse. I mean, you read all of this and you scratch your head and you go, all right, these all sound like nice things and wonderful things. But how in heaven's name does all of this make the 15th day of Av the greatest Yom Tov of the year? I mean, for crying out loud, really? My apologies, I left out also another very important reason the Gemara says why the 15th day of Av is a special Yom Tov. Because when the Jews were in the desert, the Gemara says, it was decreed upon them that for 40 years they had to remain in the desert until that entire generation died out. The way it worked, again, this is very famous, the Gemara says, anybody who turned 60 that year would dig their own graves. On the night of Tisha B'Av, they would go to sleep in their graves and they would pass in their sleep. Until the 40th year, the Jewish people who turned 60 that year went to sleep in their graves and woke up the next morning. And so it was when they woke up, they thought they had the wrong day. They went to sleep in their graves again, the next night and the next night, until the 15th day of Av came. They looked up in the heavens, they saw the full moon. They said, obviously the date of Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, is passed, and the decree has been nullified, and they no longer fear death. Again, another reason why Chamisha Asar B'Av is a Yom Tov, and the Gemara gives other reasons. At this stage, you'll take my word for it. Okay. But even after you read all these reasons, not only is it still difficult to understand why the 15th day of Av is the greatest Yom Tov of the year, but it sounds like the Gemara is making excuses. Well, it's the greatest day of the year because the people who were destined to die in the desert finished dying, or they knew that they weren't going to die. According to some commentaries, it was 1 year earlier than they thought it was going to be, or than it was supposed to be. They allowed those who had died in Beitar to be buried. They allowed the members of Shevet Binyamin to marry other tribes, despite the abuse that they had committed against the Pilegesh Megillah. I mean, these are nice things, but how do you compare it to Pesach? When we celebrate Hashem taking us out of Egypt? How do you compare it to Shavuos? We celebrate the day Hashem gave us the Torah. How do you compare it to Sukkot? We celebrate Hashem protecting the Jewish people in the desert. I mean, this is big stuff. So the Gemara goes, collect 6, 7 things in Jewish history. This decree was nullified. The Romans allowed the Jews who'd been killed in Beitar to be buried on the 15th day of Av. All right. Again, these are all significant things, but how in heaven's name does any of this make the 15th day of Av the greatest Yom Tov of the year? I mean, Rabbi Shalom, really? The greatest Yom Tov of the year? What's it supposed to mean? Why the need to exaggerate? We don't have to say that the 15th day of Av is the greatest Yom Tov of the year. Say it's a great Yom Tov. Many great special things happened in Jewish history on this day. Gesundheit. Blockades were removed. Jews could go to the Beis HaMikdash. Shidduch Day, beautiful women get married. Women from good families get married. Hakol Tov Yafeh. The greatest Yom Tov of the year. What in heaven's name is the Gemara saying? And let's ask the question of the Gemara again. So bottom line, why is the 15th day of Av the greatest Yom Tov of the year? What is it really? What is it specifically that makes the 15th day of Av such a great Yom Tov? Okay. So if you take a step back, of course, the Gemara is trying to express something bigger and deeper just than all of these specific things. Each one of these are significant in their own right. But of course, there's a broader picture here that the Gemara is trying to communicate. What is it? Well, the 15th day of Av comes 6 days after Tisha B'Av. Now, Tisha B'Av is the saddest day of the year. And this, of course, needs no explanation. No Shiur filled with Jewish history about the 6 or 7 reasons why Tisha B'Av is the saddest day in Jewish history. This needs no explanation at all. This is something that we all are in touch with, that we all know. And truth be told, when the Tisha B'Av, when the 9th day of Av comes every year, we feel it to one degree or another. We feel, again, to one degree or another, we feel the weight of all the tzoros of Jewish history weighing on our shoulders. We feel it. Even if you read just a little bit of the Kinnis and know a little bit of what you're talking about, there's a lot to cry about in Jewish history. Tisha B'Av is the day designated to mourn the losses and the pain. Let me ask you a question. Why do you think the Gemara chose to say that the greatest Yom Tov of the year is 6 days later? I mean, talk about emotional whiplash, for the love of God. Talk about extremes within 1 week. Within 1 week, we're supposed to go from the deepest pit of despair and pain and suffering to the greatest celebration in 6 days. I mean, even Rahman al-Islam, when a person sits Shiva, you give the person at least 7 days just to mourn. And then after 7 days, the person tries, begins, attempts, starts to think about putting their life together, about recuperating, etc. And even then, if a person has lost a parent, they're not really allowed to participate in a simcha for a year. There's a year of Avelis. What do you think is the wisdom? Let's ask ourselves this question. What is the wisdom of what's going on here? On an emotional level, this seems absurd. To go to have within a 6 day span, the saddest day in Jewish history, where we sit on the floor and weep over the destruction that befell our people and all of the tzaras. And then when it's over, you stand up, dust yourself off. 6 days later, Lo Hoyu Yomim Tovim LeYisrael, the greatest Yom Tov on the calendar. 6 days later. What's the message here? What's the wisdom? And what is the lesson? And the lesson, my dear friends, the commentaries explain, is actually the secret, the magic ingredient to our people's history for the past 3,500 years. To our survival, to the magic, the divine touch, the divine miracle of our existence is expressed right here in this passage of the Gemara. There's no Yom Tov on the calendar like the 15th day of Av. What is the Gemara telling us? The Gemara is telling us that the Jews have a supernatural ability. We've been given a gift by Hashem, and it is beyond the pale of nature, and one which is the most powerful trait that the Jewish people have. And you know what it is? It is that after every Tisha B'Av, after every destruction, after every pain, after every setback, after every beating that the Jewish people have taken over the course of our history, after every one of them, we are able to slowly and very painfully pick up the remains and begin the process of rebuilding. At first it is slow. At first it is painful. At first we are haunted by the memories of what happened yesterday. But even as we do, and even as we continue, and even as we live with great sensitivity for what happened yesterday, the Jews have this unbelievable, divine, godly gift and ability to pick themselves up the next day, put their right foot in front of their left foot and their left foot before their right foot, and ask themselves, okay, what are we supposed to do now? And that right there is the greatest Yom Tov on the calendar. Not because it's the happiest day, not because it's the happiest time, not because it is the moment where Hashem split the sea, or gave us the Torah, or took us out of Mitzrayim, or brought 10 plagues, or did any of the amazing, miraculous events that happened in Jewish history. None of that. But because it is the day that every Jew gets to display the miracle that the Jew is capable of doing. And the miracle that the Jew is capable of doing is that after we've been beaten with every type of Tisha B'Av in the world, within 6 days, the Jew gets up and says, okay, what do we do now? What's next? How do we write the next chapter in the book of Jewish history? And that question that the Jews have always asked themselves in every situation, that really is the greatest Yom Tov in the entire Jewish calendar. You see, Hashem can and has done amazing miracles in our history. Of course, Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim, Hashem gave us the man, Hashem split the sea. But after every miracle, there was a challenge. After every success, there was a moment of pain and of weakness. And after every triumph, there was another enemy around the corner who came to face the Jews. And after every time the Jews were beaten and pillaged and Rahman al-Islam abused by our enemies, the Jews picked themselves up. They dusted themselves off and continued. There's an old Hasidic expression. It's a beautiful kernel of wisdom. Hasidim used to say, we talk about atzvus and we talk about merirus. In one's spiritual journey, there is atzvus and merirus. Atzvus means depression. Merirus means bitterness. When one has to do teshuvah for some indiscretions of the past, one needs to feel the pain. One needs to feel bitter about what they've done. Tshuva includes a keen understanding of where it is that I went wrong, to own my own blemishes, imperfections, to own my own guilt. Sometimes it's a very painful process. So the Hasidic masters would say, one should feel bitterness, but never depression. If at all avoidable, never depression. Bitterness, yes. Depression, no. Well, how do you tell the difference? Bitterness is also painful. Bitterness can also be crushingly heavy. Bitterness can also move a person to tears, and they can sit down on the floor and weep with bitterness. And the Hasidim would say, yes, but bitterness ends. Bitterness is temporary. And at some point, after the person has experienced the necessary bitterness, they stand up and they say, okay, what am I going to do about this now? What's next? Bitterness doesn't trap you. It doesn't debilitate you. It doesn't suck the life and the soul out of you to the point where you feel disemboweled and empty on the inside, void of any willingness to continue. If anything, bitterness spurs you on. Bitterness turns to inspiration. And that's how you know that it is part of the holy teshuvah process. Atzvus, depression, on the other hand, if at all avoidable, should be avoided at all costs, because depression sucks you in and never lets you go. If you think back to every one of these issues that we discussed today, you'll see that there's a common theme that runs right through all of them. There was a time, the Gemara says, when Shevet Binyamin was scorned by the Jewish people, and rightfully so. They abused, they raped, they murdered a woman. This was indicative of the fact that the entire tribe had descended to such a dark, depraved, psychological and emotional place. They'd become perverted. And the rest of the Jewish nation turned to Shevet Binyamin and said, we want nothing to do with you. We will never let our daughters marry you. At the time, it was the right thing to do, like Rahman al-Islam, an amputation. They amputated Shevet Binyamin from themselves because of what they had done. Yes, says the Gemara. But it wasn't a permanent amputation. It was temporary. And then at some point, the Jewish people looked at it again and said, okay, it's time to move on. It's time to welcome the tribe of Binyamin back into the Jewish community. It's time to do our best to repair the damage. It's time to fix whatever it is that we can fix. It's time to turn a new page. That happened on the 15th day of Av. There was a time when kings in the north didn't allow the Jewish people to go to the Beis HaMikdash, until one king who was not a great tzaddik in his own right said, you know what? It's time to end it. And on the 15th day of Av, the blockades were removed. There was a time when Jews would die every year on Tisha B'Av. And then there was 1 year on the 15th day of Av where they looked at each other and said, okay, there will be no more of this type of death on Tisha B'Av. Chamisha Asar B'Av was a day when Jews were given an opportunity to bury their dead. They couldn't bring them back to life, but they could lay them to rest at their eternal resting place. And the healing could begin. There was even a time when Jewish people cared for each other so much that they chopped wood before the 15th day of Av to make sure that anybody who came to the temple, to the Beis HaMikdash at any point during the year and needed to offer up a sacrifice would have wood to offer it. That's because another Jew thought about them in the summer and chopped wood for them. There was a time where Jews cared for each other, unlike the Sinas Chinam that was responsible for the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. What's the Gemara saying? That these are the greatest events that happened in Jewish history? That these miracles rival the splitting of the sea and the 10 plagues and the giving of the Torah? Of course not. So what is the Gemara saying? All these miracles reflect the same idea. They reflect the idea that there was a time when a Jew could stand up after the heartbreak and the disappointment and the pain that he'd been through in Jewish history, after the Tisha B'Av, and say, you know something? After every Tisha B'Av, there's a Chamisha Asar B'Av. And there's a Chamisha Asar B'Av where Jews once again begin to hope and begin to believe and begin once again to nurture the eternal flame of Jewish optimism that never goes away. That is perhaps it's sometimes concealed, but never extinguished. Some of you may know I have the distinct pleasure of being the Rav in a shul here in Los Angeles called Shiur Tefillah. I think about this every time. I'll tell you the truth. I think about this every time I walk into the physical structure. One of the biggest, most beautiful, one of the oldest shuls in the city of Los Angeles. The shul and the community was built and nurtured and tended to by Holocaust survivors, some of whom are present here with us today on this Zoom Shiur. These were Jews who had been through the greatest Tisha B'Av of them all. They had seen it in ways that none of us can ever imagine. By the grace of God, some of them survived. And they came here and other cities like this city. And they began to build shuls and schools and communities and have families. And they did all this with love. They built this shul, beautiful shul, with love and care. And they made it a place where they and their children and their families could come and daven and study Torah and serve Hashem and experience the beauty of Yiddishkeit. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no greater Yom Tov in the world than this. There's no greater miracle in all of existence than this. There's no greater testament to the Yiddish neshama, to the eternal godly spark that exists within every Yiddish neshama than this. To go through such an experience like the Holocaust, to go through that darkest of hours, and to come out and say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to build a shul. I'm going to build a school, and Jewish people are going to come there and they're going to daven to the Rabbi Shalom, the same Rabbi Shalom against whom we have all sorts of questions. How could the Rabbi Shalom allow all this to happen? And we have no answers. We're going to daven to that Rabbi Shalom 3 times a day. We're going to learn his Torah. We're going to teach it to our children. And we're going to do it with love and with generosity and beauty and dignity and care that is unsurpassed. It is exactly about this that the Gemara says, Lo hoyu yomim tovim liYisrael. Make no mistakes, says the Gemara. Pesach, Shavuos, Sukkot pale in comparison to the 15th day of Av. Because the 15th day of Av is the day when the Jews, no less than 6 days after Tisha B'Av, stood up and declared with pride and courage and said, we will rebuild. We will bury our dead. We will reopen the roads. We will once again allow Jews to marry each other. We will tear down the walls that divide one tribe from another. And yes, we'll even make shidduchim on this day. And we'll continue to build the Jewish people. That's exactly why the 15th day of Av is the greatest Yom Tov of the year. And it's also, of course, the reason why this is Shidduch Day. Why do you think this day was chosen of all days to be Shidduch Day? Because what's the secret of a good marriage? The secret of a good marriage is exactly this. The day a husband and wife can wake up recommitted every single day and say, despite our challenges yesterday, we're going to build a beautiful marriage today. And we're going to do it again and again and again. And we'll provide it for our children. And we'll teach it to our children. And we'll never stop seeking the beauty in life. And we'll never stop seeking the love in a marriage. And we'll never stop being optimistic, no matter what. That's the correct foundation for a marriage. That's how you build a shul. That's how you build a community. That's how you build, that's what the Jewish people are, that's the stuff we're made of. It's not that Rahman al-Islam, we forget the past, of course not. We sit down on Tisha B'Av and we cry. And then 6 days later we get up and we say, okay, what happens next? How do we make sure, how do we do everything within our power to make sure this never happens again? How do we teach it to our children? How do we equip the Jewish people with the strength to stand up and be strong and proud Jews? How do we make sure that when the next curveball comes our way, when the next, when our next enemies rise up against us in all sorts of shapes and sizes and forms and threatens our existence, how do we make sure that we're going to have this, once again, the strength and courage to stand up as proud Jews and say, we were here for 3,500 years, we're an eternal people, and we are not scared. This is Chamisha Asar B'Av. The day the moon is full. The day the moon is full. The day the Jewish people are full. The day the Jewish people say, no matter how small the moon goes, to the point where it seems perhaps at the end of the month to have disappeared completely. If you wait long enough, you'll see it in its fullest of glories. It's like the Lubavitcher Rebbe once said very famously. Someone asked him, why did certain things happen in our people's history? Why? Why did this happen? And the Rebbe said, we don't know. And it's not even the right question. What do you mean it's not the right question? The Rebbe said, we're not looking for reasons. A Jew doesn't ask, why did something happen in the past? A Jew asks, what am I going to do about it in the present? Where am I empowered? What am I going to do to build a better tomorrow? After every Tisha B'Av, there is a Chamisha Asar B'Av. And that, my dear friends, is the real reason why the Gemara says Chamisha Asar B'Av is the greatest Yom Tov of the year. Have a wonderful Shabbos.